I think in the first paragraph, when he refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God, if we understand the context of that and what it means, and the fact that all men are created equal and then we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, there's this connection to heaven, and believe whatever you may about God or a divine providence, that if you absorb that in and understand our nation was founded on the idea that rights aren't just given by the state or by government, they're given to us by our Creator, our fundamental rights. Now, obviously, there's other rights and there's other privileges that come through government and law, and those can be very important. But it was in the progressive era in the late 1800s and early 1900s that certain academics and political philosophers started to discount the meaning of the Declaration.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Happy Independence Day, everyone. I'm your host, David Fromm, and welcome to the American Potential Podcast. As everyone is celebrating our freedom today, we wanted to look at the story of how a bold idea turned into a nation. Today, we're talking about the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the role Thomas Jefferson played in it, and how the words he wrote almost 2.5 centuries ago still shape the way we think about freedom, rights, government today. And one line we're going to focus on for today's episode is the famous line, "All men are created equal." This line was debated as to which men Jefferson was actually referring to, all men no matter their race or just white men. Jefferson was outspoken in his opposition to slavery, but because of strict Virginia state laws and economic realities, he found it incredibly difficult to free the slaves he owned. We're also going to look at how Jefferson inspired another president in his view of slavery. I want to welcome to this podcast J. David Gowdy, who is the president and founder of the Virginia Institute for American History. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's a privilege to be here.
Oh, great. Thanks. And as we're airing this now, I mean, happy Independence Day. Hope you and yours have a great time. And I'm so excited to.
Happy July 4th.
Yeah. And I'm happy to celebrate the birth of our nation and hear about one of the preeminent founding fathers. I mean, it's hard to overstate Thomas Jefferson's impact on this nation. So just to start out with, why was Jefferson chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence in the first place instead of some other founding fathers?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, there were many of what we call our founding fathers involved in the fight for independence and the events that led up to the Declaration itself. Jefferson was selected as part of a committee of 5 by the Second Continental Congress to draft the Declaration after Lee's resolution on June 7th saying, let's declare basically our independence from Great Britain. But, why in the committee of 5 was he chosen? Well, Adams is quoted as saying, well, we want this effort to be led by a Virginian. And of course, with Washington, Jefferson, and Lee himself and others, that was one reason. However, Jefferson had really made a name for himself, particularly in a couple years before. He had written what's called the Summary View of the Rights of British America. And in that piece, that he had argued for natural rights, he'd argued for actually against slavery and against the some of the same things that ended up in the Declaration. So he was known to be a great writer from that, and also a great advocate of liberty and of natural rights. And so, he was selected from that committee of 5, and he began drafting it after Lee's resolution was adopted on June 7th. I think it was between around the 12th of June and the 16th that he, there in Philadelphia, began writing it. And of course, he was also inspired by the Virginia Declaration of Rights by George Mason as well. But in answer to your question, I'd say the Summary View and his involvement in the efforts for independence, he was chosen to be the one that would draft it.
Now, he was quite a young man, wasn't he?
Yes, he was only 33 years old at the time, so relatively young.
Yeah, relatively young. I guess the Lord was about that age too. So, but that's Yeah, still, I mean, he did to already have a reputation as being one of the main great thinkers and writers is pretty, it certainly speaks to, his accomplishment. So, well, what were some of the main influences, either philosophical or political when he was writing the Declaration?
That's a good question. It's so interesting. He actually wrote to Henry Lee in 1825. So the year before he passed away, Jefferson wrote about what the influences were. Now, we know that Jefferson was widely read in terms of political philosophy and the rights of man, in nature and society. His library became the foundation of the Library of Congress.
Really? I did not know that.
Yes. Huh. So he was very well read, but it's interesting in this letter to Henry Lee, and that was actually May 8th of 1825, he talked about the primary influences on the Declaration. And he said, quote, all of its authority rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. And what's interesting about John Locke and Algernon Sidney, a lot of people have heard of John Locke, fewer, I think, have heard of Algernon Sidney. But when Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, along with his friend James Madison, when they talked about how they were going to teach the Constitution, they specifically focused on Locke and Sidney, Locke's second treatise in particular, and Sidney's discourses on government. So I'd say if you read second treatise, which you could do in an afternoon, discourses is a much tougher read and longer, but you would find those elements that you see in the Declaration about the laws of nature's God, about rights being divine, from our Creator, or and that type of thing.
So you mentioned that him and James Madison were close friends.
Yeah,
I knew obviously that they collaborated and were great founding fathers, but they just had did they have a deep personal friendship?
They did. Montpelier, if you're familiar with Virginia, is a one-day horse ride for Jefferson or less, from Monticello. And there was even a room, if you go visit Monticello and take the tour, you'll see there's a Madison room. So James and Dolly would actually stay at Monticello from time to time. But yes, their collaboration was more than just a political collaboration. They were friends, and they worked together on the Virginia Declaration of Religious Liberty, for example, and other things. But Madison was younger than Jefferson, and he wasn't involved in the First Continental Congress. But later on, they worked on quite a few projects together.
Yeah, what titans of as far as founding fathers. That's
amazing,
wonderful. Yeah. So when going back to when Jefferson wrote the Declaration, was there a lot that was taken out or changed from Jefferson's original draft, and why? What were the reasons given for that?
That's really important, I think, to understand that it was a significant document. I mean, it's not just two paragraphs. We think of the first two with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness more than we do the complaints or the alleged tyranny of the king in the larger body of it. But yes, Jefferson drafted it, and it went through the Committee of Five. And then after that, before the Congress, and the Congress itself made some changes. I think most of them were made by the Committee of Five, but approximately a fourth of Jefferson's original draft was taken out. And then you asked why. Well, one of them that the southern states, in particular South Carolina and others, were not happy with was that Jefferson had in his draft, the King of England has waged cruel war against human nature itself. Goes on to say the Christian King of Great Britain has determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. In other words, slavery. And so Jefferson had for years opposed slavery, and here he's stating it against the king, and South Carolina and other southern states weren't going to sign the Declaration with that in there at that point.
Well, and so it seems like, Jefferson's interaction with slavery was just kind of complicated. And so he talked a lot about ending slavery and in opposition to slavery, but he did have slaves himself. So how did he end up with slaves, and what were kind of some of the challenges he faced in trying to free them?
Yeah, it is complicated, and and some of these are just not simple answers, but I'll do my best to answer some of those questions. So one is, how did he end up with slaves? So Thomas Jefferson, of course, was born into Virginia, which was a colony of Great Britain, and there were slaves in Virginia and plantations up and down the whole state, right? And so he was born into what we might say a culture of slavery, and the operation of plantations basically was built on, in that sense, the back of slaves. And so think about being born into a society where slavery already exists, and how do you deal with that? And for him, he when his father Peter Jefferson died in 1757, Thomas was only 14 years old, but later when he was at the age of inheritance, which I believe was either 18 or 21, I'm not sure, but he inherited 30 slaves from his father. And then when he married Martha Wales Skelton, who became his wife and was his wife of 10 years, he inherited from her. She was from the Randolph family, which was prominent in Virginia. He inherited another 135, well, not inherited, but married into another 135 slaves. And so already we're approaching 200 slaves. And then probably on average, and you can check it out on Monticello's website, his slave holdings in Monticello or at Monticello probably averaged at least 200 or more. Then, yes, what did he do about slaves? So that is, again, it's complicated. But for Jefferson, who was opposed to slavery, not just in the draft of the Declaration, but when he was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, he'd actually proposed a law to end the slave trade. He supported some kind of manumission of the slaves, and it was shot down. Obviously, the slave trade and not so much trade, but slavery itself was ingrained to Virginia, not only Virginia, but Southern society. But he opposed it. He called it a moral depravity, a hideous blot, and he believed that slavery was the greatest threat to the survival of the new American nation, which,
really?
Of course, it kind of proved to be, in the sense that it eventually led to the Civil War. He thought slavery was contrary to the laws of nature, but he believed in democratic principles, that if we're going to form a republic and we're going to look to the voice of the people, we can't just mandate the end of slavery. It has to be a choice of the people, and primarily in this case, of course, the people of the South. So that was one factor. And then other limiting factors, he did free one of his slaves. It was his cook, James Hemmings. He had trained him when he was over in France. As we know, Jefferson spent a good number of years in France on behalf of America as the foreign minister. But he had trained James Hemmings in France, and he cooked for him. He had given him his freedom, and James moved to Baltimore, got a job, unfortunately began drinking, I think became an alcoholic, and he committed suicide at age 36. This troubled Jefferson deeply, that his, I don't know if I'd call him a friend, but I mean, his close cook and associate that he had worked to be able to give him his freedom, so to speak, that we'd have a way to go make a living, took his life. Practically speaking, if you can imagine, if it's a slave society and you're going to free your slaves, the question is, well, where will they go? And what will they do to make a living? And how can they actually live independently? That's practical. On the legal side, Jefferson not only inherited slaves, but he inherited debt. And while he strove during his, what we'll say, career, and of course most of it was spent 40 years or more on behalf of the nation, he did have his own plantation that he tried to run efficiently, and his debts were never discharged fully. So as under the law at that time, slaves were considered property or chattel. They were subject to the, call it mortgages or liens, of the debtors that he owed money to. And so another practical obstacle was he couldn't free the slaves because he'd be selling them because they were subject to that lien, or if you follow. And then
I understand that.
Yeah. The other challenge was that in Virginia, they actually did pass a law in 1792 that allowed manumission, but only on the event that the slaves left the state within a year. And for Jefferson and one of his friends actually went with some of the slaves to Illinois to help that happen. But for Jefferson, how do you manage that process, so to speak, to make sure your slaves can leave the state? I mean, whether you believe it or not, he cared for them as a people. He obviously fed them, clothed them, or made sure they had means to do so. And there was some of a fatherly type relationship. He was known as a benevolent master, for what that may be worth. And practically speaking, legally speaking, under the laws of Virginia, how do you get your slaves out of the state if you free them and make sure, again, they end up somewhere where they're not re-enslaved?
Yeah. So Thomas Jefferson's viewpoint on slavery really ended up shaping another president's viewpoint, to my understanding. So who was that president, and how did Jefferson influence him?
Yes. So Abraham Lincoln, born in 1809, grew up, and as a young man, self-taught, read the writings in wherever he could of Jefferson and Washington and others. And Jefferson, in one sense, kind of became a hero of Lincoln. But why? Because of the principles of Jefferson. He called them the maxims of a free society. And Lincoln actually said that he never had a feeling politically that didn't spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And you see this throughout Lincoln's political career, his speeches, and of course his presidency, and ultimately emancipation. But even looking at the Gettysburg Address, the nation was founded on the proposition that all men are created equal. So Lincoln took up, in a sense, the cause. But again, what was the challenge? I mean, you had slavery existing in the southern states. You'd had these crises before the Civil War of nullification and other issues. And as Lincoln understood, it was going to take time and persuasion. And the greatest way, I think, to understand Lincoln's position is to look at the debates that he had with Stephen Douglas.
Yeah, the great debates, right?
The great debate.
I live in Illinois, so we're very well steeped in our Lincoln knowledge, I hope.
Yes. Yeah, the great debates were, and I've read a couple books on it, but I'm just saying it's probably the best way of understanding the challenge of slavery at the time is to understand the arguments of Stephen Douglas, who's speaking basically for the slave states. Mm-hmm. And even though he's in Illinois, but he's the main contention in the debates, the main topic was the expansion of slavery to the territories. Are we going to allow slavery to expand? I mean, it exists where it is. The Constitution provided a way for the slave trade to end after 20 years. And actually, Jefferson was president when that happened and signed it into law in 1808. But there's still slavery. And how are we going to end it? And Douglas is arguing for popular sovereignty, saying, well, we're going to let the territories vote and decide whether or not we're going to allow slavery. And Lincoln is saying, basically, that's a moral wrong. You can't vote people into slavery, so to speak. But I want to say that one of Lincoln's main points in the debates that stood out to me was that, and we believe this as well, he did serve one term in the U.S. Congress, and he did lose this election. But in the time that he was in Washington, D.C., he spent time in the Library of Congress, and he had researched the issue, and this was the question that he posed to himself. Did any of the signers of the Declaration, did any of the first members of the First Continental Congress, did Jefferson or Washington or, any of the founders, Franklin, Hamilton, etc., ever say that all men are created equal did not apply to the blacks or to the slaves? And he had researched that issue, and he argues that very distinctly in these debates, saying, I challenge any man to say that they can find any quote from any of those men. Again, I mean, we're talking about not just, 12 men. We're saying dozens of men connected with the founding that ever said that that all men created equal did only mean white men. It meant all men.
Yeah.
And Lincoln points out that you can declare all men are created equal, but that doesn't make it easy or possible immediately for them to become equal in society. So there's natural rights, which Jefferson always stood for, that they are born free and equal, but they're subject to civil restrictions. And Lincoln saying, hey, it's going to take time and we need to set it as a standard that they do become equal, but it's not automatic because it was declared in the Declaration, but it was true.
So that's really fascinating. I love the bridge between these two just monumental figures in American history. Kind of looking at the bigger picture, how do you think Jefferson's words in the Declaration and Lincoln's interpretation of them, kind of continue to influence the way we think about our freedoms today?
I think that history serves, in this particular instance, a great opportunity for us in our generation to realize that some things haven't changed. I mean, there are race issues today. There is prejudice and things like that. But if we realize, as I said in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that our nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, what does that mean? Well, obviously, we're not equal in a lot of ways and never will be. And we can think of how we're born or where we're born and our physical characteristics, and some people are smarter than others and some people are richer than others, but we're equal in our rights. And if we look at the fact that meant that we have natural rights endowed by our Creator and therefore we're equal, I think it helps us understand that we should treat each other as brothers and sisters on one level. And in another level, when we look at the problems of our nation, if we would re-embrace the Declaration and that great truth or self-evident truth, I think it would change some of the discourse around these issues of race and of equality, and what does equality mean, and how the founders meant what they said. I just as a footnote, when the South seceded, South Carolina and others seceded from the Union, they actually argued the founders were wrong. They stood for the proposition that men weren't equal and that you had to earn liberty and that some races were subject to being under the control of others, which obviously we don't believe, I don't think, or most people don't. But coming back to this, that some of the discourse we have and discussions and arguments, sometimes very heated arguments about this, I think could be resolved if we would embrace the Declaration and the language of the Declaration and know that Jefferson, not only Jefferson, but the signers and all those connected to the founding up through Lincoln's time meant what they said. And only when the South tried to start defending slavery did they start arguing some of these other things that actually some people embrace today that are false.
So obviously Jefferson was just one of the titans of our nation's founding and setting our, the course for the rest of our nation and what the bedrock that it's built upon. It really is pretty fascinating how the Declaration and then the Constitution stand up over time as just these, transformational documents that transcend time and generations. But then this might be a hard thing to do, but is there one or two things about Jefferson and what he wrote or in the Declaration that you just think are the most important contributions, or that were just so essential to our nation's founding and then its growth till now?
Yes, I think in the first paragraph, when he refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God, if we understand the context of that and what it means, and the fact that all men are created equal and then we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, there's this connection to heaven, and believe whatever you may about God or a divine providence, that if you if you absorb that in and understand our nation was founded on the idea that rights aren't just given by the state or by government, they're given to us by our Creator, our fundamental rights. Now, obviously, there's other rights and there's other privileges that come through government and law, and those can be very important. But it was in the progressive era in the late 1800s and early 1900s that certain academics and political philosophers started to discount the meaning of the Declaration. They actually were arguing, Wilson and others, to basically abandon natural rights. And without getting too much into it, there was elements of Marxism, there was elements of Darwinism and other elements that were playing. But they were basically saying modern times require modern solutions, and we're going to basically walk away from the Declaration. We're going to honor the founders, and we're going to say they did a good thing for their time, but it's not applicable today. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous when you say we're going to abandon the Declaration and its principles because we're in a modern society and we don't need those principles anymore. And I would argue that they are timeless principles, as Jefferson, but also Lincoln said, and that they do apply today, and that if we would apply them and stick to them, that would help us preserve the freedoms and the liberty that we have for future 4th of Julys.
Yeah, well, who better to come on and talk about the founding of the nation than someone from the Virginia Institute for American History. I mean, Virginia, I imagine you'd argue that they beat everybody else in terms of American history and being the
well, Virginia is a wonderful place, and I have lived there, a number of years. I'm not from Virginia, but yes, the history there of Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and others, Monroe, and the sites that you can go to. Then, of course, the Civil War. 60% of the battles of the Civil War were fought in Virginia. And I live close to Washington and Lee University. Think about the history of those names. But anyway, Virginia was at the forefront of the Revolution. And hopefully not just us, but all of us can be on the forefront of maintaining the amazing timeless principles that are contained in there. The consent of the governed, the duty we have to defend against tyranny, and things like that. So I hope everybody on the 4th of July will reread at a minimum the first 2 paragraphs.
That's a great encouragement. Yeah. In between your hot dogs and your fireworks, I do want to leave, I guess, with one thing that you brought out that I really appreciate, because we used to, we're a grassroots organization at Americans for Prosperity, and we would ask rooms of just regular people like, hey, where do your rights come from? And the fact that the Declaration says that they come from the Creator, they're given to us from God, I think it frames it all so differently. It's so important and so central. And when people are trying to, tyranny or other ways of trying to be authoritarian, trying to take those rights from us, but they're not granted to us by other men. It's given to us, by the Creator. I think that's one of the most powerful things. I'm so glad that you highlight that.
No, thank you. And I think that sometimes we misunderstand tyranny. And, we watch movies where the tyrant, has a particular look, and they sort of wear a placard that we know who the tyrant is in the movie. Well, for the founders, George III wasn't necessarily look like a tyrant or seem like a tyrant to them early on in the colonies, but gradually there were things that happened that led them to believe that there was a long train of abuse. Well, there was, ended up being a long, as they say, Jefferson wrote, a long train of abuses. But for us to be able to identify tyranny also, and there's kind of a lesson there, I think, in the rest of the Declaration as to how they identified tyranny, and it's not always easy, and how we can hopefully identify tyranny, because that's the great opposite threat to liberty, is tyranny. And so anyway, some things to think about.
Well, David, I so appreciate you joining us, and thank you for on this 4th of July, really giving us some great things to think about. And I encourage everyone to go out and read the first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration, just like David recommended. So thanks again.
No, thank you, David. And it's always good to remember too that this is the 249th celebration, and the 250th, as we may know, is coming up next year. And on the 50th, some people may know this, Jefferson and Adams, both signers, passed away. So we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of their passing next year. So,
yeah. Oh, great. Thank you.
No, thank you, David.
But folks, Jefferson's words, over 2 centuries ago, didn't just launch a revolution. They sparked an ongoing conversation about freedom, equality, and what it means to be an American. Hopefully today, as you celebrate, you'll take some time to think about the men who debated those ideas and gave us the freedoms that we had today. If you'd like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to subscribe and like our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, especially on Independence Day, always remember liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.